Papa Bear Tim here in the office. I have a very special Google Doc presentation I want to share with you today regarding Neville Goddard and some of his buddies. A lot of people get into these manifestation concepts and they think it's Neville or bust, or they find Abraham Hicks and then they find Neville and they get really excited and they think that Neville is really unique. And Neville is really unique in so many ways, but there's also so many ways in which Neville is similar to a lot of the other teachers we talk about in this channel. And if you see that more, you'll, I think, appreciate not only Neville more, but you'll get exposed to all these other wonderful teachers that are using slightly different language, but are basically saying the same thing as Neville. And what I found over the years, because I got into a lot of these manifestation concepts through Neville, and then I edited and wrote a lot of books about him. I got really into Neville, but I found that the more I got into other teachers, some of whom I'm going to talk about here, that spoke about this stuff in a slightly different way than Neville, the more I appreciated what Neville said, and the more I was able to holistically integrate this stuff into my life. So I want to talk about a few of my other favorite teachers today besides Neville, and honestly, people that these days, now, 12 years after I've discovered Neville, that I'm actually studying more than Neville because I appreciate their language right now during this manifestation journey, even more than I do Neville's. Just to give you an idea of why we don't want to be dogmatic and why it's very helpful often to incorporate as many of these teachers in as we can if we resonate with some of what they say. Now, one thing people don't like about manifestation teachings is that all these teachers and anybody talking about this stuff, including Papa Bear Tim, say a bunch of bullcrap. So it's about taking what you like and disregarding the rest. A lot of people don't feel comfortable doing that. This probably is not the channel for you if you don't feel comfortable doing that. I really hope that you just take what you like from a teacher, the certain language they use that you like, and just forget the rest of what they say, including what Papa Bear Tim says. All right. So if you get even just a couple things from this video, I'll be a happy Papa Bear Tim. I'm going to the share screen right now because I want to show you this Google Doc. This was just pinned out by GPT. It's nothing brilliant, but we're going to talk about language, right? Because we hear terms like imagination all the time in the law of assumption space. We also hear the term consciousness a lot in the law of attraction space and in the manifestation spaces in general. We also hear terms like physiology when we hear people talking about how their imagination works. So let's kind of connect all three of those things quickly. As I said, several of my favorite manifestation teachers are using different language in terms to describe essentially the same thing, the same organizing intelligence that a lot of us would say is what makes manifestation work, the intelligence behind human experience. And each of these teachers approaches, it from a slightly different domain, different angle. It might be contemplative recognition, psychological function, or physiological expression. The vocabulary differs, but the underlying observation is consistent. For instance, and this is important, Joel Goldsmith, who we speak about a ton on this channel, speaks in contemplative language most of the time and describes consciousness as the source through which life expresses itself. Now, let me mention here, and if you're familiar with this channel, this will not be new. I love Joel Goldsmith. I personally really don't relate to how he uses that term consciousness. I think it's very misguiding a lot of the time. When I think of the term consciousness, it doesn't really resonate with me as much as something like imagination does. Yet, because I'm familiar enough with these teachings and see the similarities, I'm able to replace that word consciousness with a word like imagination, which fits more to my liking and how I look at these ideas very easily when I read Goldsmith. So even though I don't love how Joel tosses the term consciousness around, especially because he uses a big C a lot of the time, and I'm just like, what are you saying, dude? Nonetheless, I'm able to get the deeper point of what he's saying a lot of the time because I understand he's speaking about the same creative principle that people like Emile Coué and Neville were talking about. Now, Emile Coué, who is probably my favorite manifestation type of teacher, speaks in clinical and psychological language and describes imagination, that's the word I like, as the dominant organizing faculty of the organism. But it's worth saying that Coué always said that from a practical standpoint, not getting overly clinical, but practically speaking, the terms unconscious and subconscious are synonymous with imagination. So, in other words, if you don't like the term imagination, you might like the term subconscious or unconscious. And Coué says they're getting to the same thing. Coué said your unconscious is your imagination. You could also make the small leap here, this is the point of this video, to say that your consciousness is another term for imagination, or perhaps unconscious and subconscious are really pointing at the same thing, even though at first blush they look like different terms. When we get deeper, they're all connecting the same thing, the creative principle of how the organism operates. Coué's core insight was simple. When imagination is aligned, the organism reorganizes naturally. When the will or our willpower tries to oppose imagination, strain and conflict appear. Okay? Law of reversed effort. Willpower is good, but unfortunately, it works against our imagination a lot of the time. The imagination will always override your willpower. We've made many, many videos on this. Links will be in the description for all this stuff, by the way. Neville, which is why I'm sure some of you are watching this video, also used the term imagination. And that was his key term, obviously, but he described it using more spiritual language, a more spiritual term. He went so far as to say your imagination is God. Your imagination is God. But again, he was very big on using the term imagination, as was Coué. Now, Neville's buddy, Joseph Murphy, who language-wise is probably the most similar to Neville. Neville and Murphy are very similar. He didn't use imagination as much. He preferred to use, of course, subconscious, right? He wrote that classic book, The Power of Your Subconscious Mind. Murphy described a similar mechanism through the language of the subconscious mind. He described the manifestation mechanism, I should say, through the language of the subconscious mind. In the same way that Neville described the manifestation mechanism through imagination, as did Coué, and Goldsmith described it through consciousness, right? So consciousness, imagination, subconscious, Coué even threw unconscious in there. And again, Murphy described the subconscious mind as having an automatic intelligence that regulates and expresses life without conscious control, a self-sustaining, life-giving energy or power is how Murphy describes it so wonderfully in The Power of Your Subconscious Mind and elsewhere. So, although these terms differ, the terminology varies, these teachers are pointing towards the same fundamental recognition. Life organizes itself through an intelligence that operates prior to conscious effort, hard, effortful thinking. Again, that's not to say you shouldn't use your conscious thought, it can be very valuable. But if you're trying too hard to think the right way, these ideas do not work well. This goes beyond normal conscious thinking. And that's why you're hearing terms like consciousness with a capital C, or imagination, or subconscious. Goldsmith describes the recognition of this through contemplative awareness. Coué, Neville, and Murphy describe how the organism responds psychologically through imagination or subconscious processes. But there's an even simpler way to see the same truth if we want to really just look at it. We can observe it directly through our physiology. And that's one reason I got into these ideas in the first place, is I recognize they are describing physiological functions within us that are inherent. One of my favorite, more, just crazy anarchist spiritual teachers, UG Krishnamurti, I've made podcast episodes about him before. He basically said your body is incredibly intelligent. Your physiology is your supply, really, right? You hear God is supply. Goldsmith loves saying God is supply. Hughes would say your physiology is supply. So we can observe these manifestation principles and their processes directly through our physiology. Breathing continues without our effort. The nervous system regulates and recalibrates. Cells repair and regenerate. Energy rises and falls throughout the day. Attention naturally resets after periods of strain. In other words, the organism is constantly sustaining and reorganizing life. As Murphy talks about in The Power of Your Subconscious Mind, it's constantly regenerating and sustaining you. It's a life-giving principle. Okay, this is all tied to manifestation. And as I said, interestingly, it's also tied to some of the stuff that UG Krishnamurti talked about. So if you look at it from this more physiological angle, this requires no belief system or metaphysical framework to observe or for it to work. It's simply how living systems function. From this perspective, physiology itself demonstrates supply. You say God is supply. You could also say physiology is supply, as I said. Life is visibly maintaining itself through the body moment by moment. When interference, especially mental interference, is reduced, whether through contemplative stillness, relaxed imagination, or simple nervous system regulation, the organism naturally returns to its self organizing rhythm and becomes more self sustaining. Tasks are approached when energy arises. Rest occurs when the system needs recovery. Attention reorganizes and clarity returns. What Coué and Neville described as imagination, what Murphy called the subconscious, and what Goldsmith called consciousness can all be understood as different descriptions of the same underlying reality, life expressing and sustaining itself through the organism. Seen this way, the most immediate evidence of supply is not an abstract idea, not some crazy metaphysical concept, but the simple fact that all of a living body continuing to regulate, adapt, and sustain itself. I should say the simple fact of a living body continuing to regulate, adapt, and sustain itself. Breathe, repair, energy, adaptation. Life is already supplying life. Man, that's why I love a lot of these manifestation concepts, not because they are so wildly conceptual, but because when you boil it down to their essence, really ties the mind and body together in a very practical and helpful way. So I hope this short video helped you in some manner. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out to me at radicalcounselor.com.